Well, hi there, and welcome to week 4 of the Emotionally Healthy Woman podcast. I am your co-host, Kathy Bruce, and this podcast features a series of my conversations with author Geri Scazzero based on her book, The Emotionally Healthy Woman. And if you were around with us last week, you'll know that we talked about quit dying to the wrong things. And this week, we're going to be discussing quit denying anger, sadness, and fear. And so now I would like to introduce to you Geri Scazzero. Welcome, Geri, to the podcast.
Good morning, Kathy. I am doing well. Thank you on this winter morning.
I know we can't seem to get rid of the snow.
Yes, but I love it. I love the snow.
Well, it'll probably be over soon, but this has been a very snowy winter for New York.
Yes.
But I love it too. Well, we have so much to cover today. This is one of my personal favorite topics, and a topic that really I've done a lot of work in my own life through, thanks to you and Pete and the Emotionally Healthy Discipleship courses that have helped me to quit denying my anger, sadness, and fear, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So the chapter 4 in your book is titled Quit Dying to Anger, Sadness, and Fear. And so we're going to try and get through as much as we can. Obviously, there's so much to talk about in regards to emotions. And so let's just get going. Let's just dive right in, because one of the most important things I think you talk about in this chapter, and we've talked a little about processing emotions in a couple of the past few podcasts we've done, but not in the context of our family of origin. Could you talk a little bit about the connection between how someone expresses, responds to their emotions, and how their family of origin did that? What's the link there?
There is a direct link. And you probably can go back. You can go to your, also not just your parents, but your grandparents and your great grandparents, because whatever was, for example, whatever acceptable to your parents, whatever emotions they're comfortable with, you're allowed to have. Whatever emotions they weren't comfortable having, you probably were not allowed to have. And they learned that from their parents, right? Your grandparents gave your parents messages about what emotions were okay, what emotions weren't okay. And most of this was not verbal necessarily, although it might have been, big boys don't cry, little girls smile. But many times it can also be, lots of nonverbal messages and things like that. But yes, we learn how to deal with our emotions, how to think about our emotions, what to do with our emotions was all formed in our families. And sometimes it can be, let's say you grew up in a family where anger was handled irresponsibly. So you may come into adulthood. Now you have your own family or not, but you can handle now anger one of two ways, having grown up with it, where maybe it was scared to be around anger. One, you can totally suppress it and avoid angry people because anger is scary to you. Or you've learned to take your anger out on other people because that's what was modeled for you. So either way, we've internalized messages about emotions absolutely from our families. Our parents.
Yeah. And I know when we were talking earlier, you had mentioned, just the importance of our emotions. Can you speak to that for a moment about how God wired us and how important they are?
Yeah. And the reason for us to really note the criticalness of emotions to our humanity and our Christianity is because for some reason, so many of us in the church have gotten wrong messages about our emotions, that certain emotions are bad, certain emotions should be denied, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we'll probably talk about that a little bit more in the podcast. But first and foremost, foundationally, God would say our emotions are good. They're very good. They're God-given. They're important. and um, not they're important for lots of reasons, but the least of which is I need emotions to love well. I
Wow.
cannot love my neighbor. I can't even love myself. I can't love my neighbor as myself without experiencing my emotions. And I would go as far as to say is they're as important as oxygen and water and food, because we can't live without love.
Mm,
You can't, you really, a person can't grow into their wholeness, their full humanity without love. And you can't survive without oxygen and water and food. And so, love is important for a full life, a full humanity, wholeness, and you can't love without experiencing your emotions. So they are critical to
wow.
be a human being fully alive, made in the image of God, who loves well.
I mean, we don't talk about these things in the church. I mean, I'll speak from my experience in churches that I've been in the past, not the one I'm currently in, but talking about emotions and recognizing them as good and vital to who we are is I find a very rare topic of conversation
Yeah,
in the
and it
church.
really goes back to a historical, and I'm not going to go into that here, but it does go back to a historical moment in the church where, and not just the church, but in our culture where we became more rationally minded
Mm,
and less integration of emotions.
right.
And so, and whatever is happening in the world influences the church.
Sure.
So, but biblically speaking, God has never been against emotions. As a matter of fact, he's given them to us as a critical piece of our humanity, for loving well.
Yeah. That's good. That's good. Well, let's talk. Let's go back to the anger topic for a moment. This is one of the emotions. So we talked a little about the Enneagram last week, and I'm an 8 on the. I identify with the 8s,
Mhm.
and I find that in my life, the anger is one of the emotions that is very easily accessible for me.
Mhm.
It's one that I can express not healthfully if I don't watch myself. Some of that comes from the 8s like to have control over things, and we don't really have control over much. So,
You're also passionate about unjust things,
yeah, yeah,
right? You see things that aren't, right, and people that get marginalized, and you're spokespeople for them.
sure. So some of it is righteous anger,
Yeah,
I would
yeah,
say, but the unhealthy side of it
yeah,
can
yes.
become negative. But I wonder. So there are a couple things you talk about in this chapter, specifically about how um, helpful anger actually can be in clarifying our values. It can also signal deeper emotions, and yet some people are unaware of their anger. How is that? Because I'm usually aware of my anger, but
Right.
how is that? Like, how is that for you? I know you talk in the book a little bit about this, as experiencing it yourself.
Depending on the messages that people got growing up around anger will determine how they experience it, um, and what they do with it. So, in my experience working with people, the majority of people may not acknowledge their anger, but they may be suppressing it, but they're somewhat aware of it, and it is the emotion that they can feel.
Mm,
But for some people, uh, the anger was such a taboo emotion that's not on their radar, but hurt might be. Uh, so that's just something to pay attention to. But anger is a very complex emotion, and when I say complex, not unknowable, because it's really important to learn your experience of anger. Like, for example, I can speak for myself.
hmm
I learned so much about my anger. One, that I had a message that somewhere I got the message that it's bad, or it's okay in certain circumstances. Like I could express anger to, maybe I could show Pete and the girls my anger, but I wouldn't show my anger outside my home
Mm.
to others, to people I didn't know well. Or I couldn't get angry with Pete, and that was okay. I didn't feel guilty about it at all. I do now. I mean, I have a healthy, but if he got angry with me, it felt like death. So it was
Wow.
really, yeah, it was really interesting for me to begin to pay attention to how I experienced anger in different situations. And then of course, once in a while, not often, but my anger was really helpful in trying to tell me, hey, I've had a value here that's been violated. Maybe somebody's crossed my boundaries, or something important to me is being denied or something. And so my anger is a signal that I need to assert myself here. Um, or my anger has become a signal as to, ooh, something else is going on. And this is usually the one that happens to me the most, that I get angry, but most of the time it's not really what I'm feeling.
Mm.
There's always something. It's just anger is the feeling that I feel. That's like the first one that comes to the surface. It's at the surface for me. But what I'm really feeling as I peel it back is something else. And this happened just last night. We were making dinner and I realized I was irritable. And I could sense like my irritability in barking orders like to Pete and my daughter as they were my assistant chefs in the kitchen. And I paused and I said to myself, oh, Geri, I said this to myself. I said, you got to watch your tone of voice, or you got to watch something's going on here. And I said to myself, what is going on? I feel like I'm projecting my anger out here, or irritability is what I was calling it, which
Right.
is a form of anger.
Right. Sure.
And so I knew it in a minute that actually, and not even in a minute, that I was actually grieving around sadness and disappointment for a family member who I know is um, about to be very disappointed and sad about something that's not going to happen in their life. Like and I realized I was grieving for them. I was
Mm.
actually grieving for them, but it was coming out in anger to those people around me. And so it was just really important. I mean, I've done enough work that I can catch that in a
Right.
minute.
Right.
But when I was first learning, it would take a lot longer.
Yeah. And that was a pivotal thing for me, I think, when I was going through the EHD courses for the very first time, was realizing the complexity that anger actually there can be a connection there to sadness and loss. That often, like, I mean, what you described is just a beautiful example of that. Is actually, it was coming out as anger, but it wasn't really anger that you were feeling. It was
No.
a different emotion
Yeah.
of the sadness
I
and
was actually
grief.
in a mini grieving process, the beginning of which is anger, right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, that is the first step of a grieving. But the problem is I was projecting my anger in the grieving process towards my husband and daughter. But again, so important for me to become aware of. And I know we're talking to a lot of leaders in this podcast, and you mentioned loss. Yes, I mean, so much of our anger is around loss. I mean, just think about the pandemic.
Yeah. Lots of loss.
But even aside from the pandemic, Kathy, leaders have so much loss.
Hmm.
They have their own personal losses that just happen to all of us being on earth as human beings. It can be a disappointment in the day. It can be something in your family. It can be something from work. It can there, but you are also, as a leader, grieving other people's losses.
Right. Right. You're carrying them.
You're carrying it. And so that can come out as anger. So
Mm.
it is really crucial for leaders to understand and discern their emotions, so they can get underneath their anger, become aware of it, and then take right action, which
Yeah.
I think we'll talk about later.
Speaking of the sadness and loss, it's so interesting to me because I think sadly, again, if we go back to the church and to Christians and how we were raised and taught to deal with these emotions of loss and grief, or not taught how to, not modeled well how to. It's so interesting to me because we have so many biblical examples. You give some in this chapter of people in the Bible who are very in touch with their loss. If we look at, the whole book of Psalms, right? David is crying out to the Lord. I mean, he is definitely in touch. Jeremiah and the whole book of Lamentations, and then Jesus himself. Why? So why, if we are studying the scriptures and we're studying these biblical heroes of faith and of Jesus himself, why do you think we have such a hard time in the church responding to loss and expressing sadness?
I think it goes back to your family of origin and what you internalized. When we're being formed as children, we are internalizing, and it's in us like concrete.
Mm.
We were liquid cement, liquid. You ever see a sidewalk being poured, and then somebody comes and puts their initials in it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we were liquid cement, and our caregivers gave us messages in that liquid cement that are internalized within us. We carry those then into the church. The church may add a layer, but it really goes back to what we learned in our families.
Mm.
And now we can find verses to support those messages. Don't
Right.
let the sun go down on your anger, which is actually a beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But we take these verses and we say, oh, well, anger must be bad, or sadness must be bad, because it says rejoice always. Again, I say
Right.
rejoice.
Right. And that verse has been taken, I think, I experienced that after 9/11 at the church I was in. 9/11 happened.
Wow.
And I go to talk to people in the church the next day, and they're like, well, the Bible says, we're to rejoice always. And I'm like, are you kidding me?
Right.
I can't rejoice right now.
Right.
But there's that
Right.
sort of like guilt. If I'm not rejoicing like everybody else, am I not being a good
Yeah.
Christian? I mean,
it's terrible. And I'll just throw this in here. But like, we've now cut ourselves off. We've just severed the whole mental health, the community of people with really mental health challenges, which we all are on a spectrum of mental health challenges. But what do you do with people who experience, bipolar or whatever? Like, they can't be in the church if that's our theology.
right.
And so yes, it really it goes back to our families again, and it's not hard to find verses to support what we've internalized. And so that's why it's so important as followers of a Christ to examine how we were formed. Before you were in the church, you were in the family, and that's who formed you. And so when Bible says be transformed, really we have to be transformed from what we learned, unhealthy messages from our families.
Right. So we have to kind of undo those.
Yeah, we do. We have to redo them. Yes, we have to. Yeah. And but David got it right, and Jeremiah got it right, and I mean, they were living into their humanity. But it is, so the church can teach us all they want. We can hear a message all we want every week, but that messages are internalized more through experience than just words. And that's why it is a truism: more is caught than taught. In our childhoods, we caught by nonverbals most of what we have internalized.
Right.
And that's what we have to give that's how we have to really teach in the church as well. That's why presence is so important. A teacher, as a leader, that I'm being present with human beings, how I speak to them, how I look at them, All those things are important in what I'm communicating to them about their own self-worth.
Hmm. Yeah, that's good. Well, the last emotion, so kind of speaking of physicality, the last emotion you talk about in this chapter, and obviously there's more emotions, but these are the three you hone in on this chapter, is fear. And one of the things I love that you write about in this book, and we've talked about this again in previous podcasts, is there's a science of fear in this chapter. You wrote, this is what you wrote: fear is a natural response to perceived threats and dangers. And there's a real physiological response that happens in our bodies, and yet we can often suppress that. We can feel guilty about it, or, fear can also paralyze us.
Mhm.
So I was wondering if you could share a little bit of how have you experienced renewed health in this area of fear in your own life?
Right. Becoming aware of what is behind the fear. What am I afraid of? I've learned how to identify it in my body. So the alarm goes off in my body, a tightening in my chest or something in my stomach or my neck and shoulders. I got, oh, something. And and then I say, well, okay, what am I afraid of? And I would say a lot of the fear goes back to the thread of where we find our okayness.
Hmm.
So, do I find my okayness in always being right? I can't make a mistake. My fear of making a mistake, or my fear of not being needed, or my fear, there might be a fear of failure, a fear of, these really go hand in hand with the whole Enneagram inventory, but the fear of being ordinary, not making my mark in the life, my mark,
Mm.
my in life. Let's see, my fear of not knowing what I should know, my fear of pain, my fear of not being in control. So my fear of conflict.
That's a big one.
That's a big one. So anyway, I think if people have to learn they have to feel the fear. And again, usually starts in your body.
Hmm.
And then okay, what is that? And then peeling it back to say, what is it? What am I afraid of? And some that takes some work. It takes practice and work, but eventually, like anything, it'll become kind of second nature.
Yeah. Well, and isn't it amazing that God created us in this way, that our bodies would respond in that way to show us, to, it's like an indicator flashing light.
Right.
Hey, something's going on here, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's, I love that God in his infinite wisdom of creation, created us to have these physiological changes when we do experience fear. So
And that's why the sad and dangerous thing, Kathy, is that I would say majority of people don't feel the gift that God has given us. That, like, these are an internal our feelings are an internal GPS system
mm,
to guide
that's
us.
good.
But when we don't feel them, then they start shouting in our bodies, whether it's through depression, whether it's through migraines, whether it's through an ulcer. I mean, most physical ailments can be tied back to some kind of emotional something or other,
Yeah.
unacknowledged emotional, whether it's a heart attack or high blood pressure.
Yeah. Like stress.
Oh,
Like,
it's amazing. It's
yeah.
amazing. The connection is indisputable. And so again, all the more important that we learn to receive this gift of I of feeling our emotions, identifying our emotions, and then discerning how God wants to come to us through them.
That's wonderful. Love it. Well, we have a few more minutes, and we've really covered a lot here. There's so much more about even each of these individual emotions we could certainly cover. But thank you for just giving us such a great perspective of why it's so important. And I would love to leave our listeners today with some just some practical applications, some tools. I know for me, the journaling, I had stopped journaling for years. And when I started doing the EHD courses again a few years back, I really got back into it. And so the journaling has been a really big thing for me. But I wonder if you could talk about just some other tips and tools to help us get in touch with our emotions, feel the feels, and then how to, deal with them, how to respond to them.
When I first got on this journey of emotionally healthy discipleship, I mean, my feeling muscles were they were almost non-existent. I did not know how to identify my emotions except for anger. And then I could identify it, but I wouldn't admit it, which was a problem. Right. So I was, denying it. Even though I knew it was anger, but I was denying it because I thought it was a bad emotion. So I had to, like, going to the gym, and if you're a newbie in physical fitness and you want to start uh, getting stronger, a lot of people go to the gym. They set aside a time to go and work out and develop their muscles. And that's exactly what I did. I said, I need to develop a workout for feeling.
That's really a good analogy.
So I set aside, I mean, I was really bad at feeling, really bad. I mean, like I said, I couldn't tell sadness from anxiety. I couldn't name them. I couldn't identify them. So so of course, first there was the help of a counselor that began to help us identify them. But then now we're on our own. So how can we continue this work and develop and grow stronger? So twice a week, I stopped. I set aside a certain time. I stopped, and in the day, for about half hour, 45 minutes, and asked myself a question like, okay, how did I feel about the interactions I've had today? Because that's where a lot of time where feelings come out, an
Hmm.
interaction we have with people. So so much fodder was in that. And I would just begin to journal my real feelings. Like, wow, that's how I really felt in that interaction.
Hmm.
Oh, or that's how I felt, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I did journal. They say the pen is the best eye.
Okay.
And so, in other words, you can think about it, and that's helpful. But when you actually write something down, and I can name it verbally, that's helpful. But then when you actually put it on paper, that's even a different experience.
It's like it's more real.
Yeah, it's more real. It's also helps, I think, with the process of internalizing that truth, of
Hmm.
internalizing truth. So, and then I might share it with Pete or someone, a trusted someone, because again, verbalizing it is another way to begin to internalize it. So those are all steps to internalizing it,
Hmm. Hmm.
taking the time to think about it, um, be honest about it, write it down, and then share it with someone. And, so
Yeah, I'm
that,
glad I'm glad you mentioned the processing it with a trusted friend, because I know, some people are verbal processors, some people are not. I'm a verbal processor. So
yeah,
I finding somebody that I can talk through my emotions with is super helpful.
that's
So
great.
getting in touch with whether or not verbal processing is helpful, to find somebody trusted is a
Yeah.
great
Yeah.
tip as
Yeah.
well.
That's great.
Well, this has been fantastic. We have covered so much in a half an hour. Are there any other sort of leaving thoughts you would like to leave us with in terms of emotions? Any other tips or tools you would urge
Um,
people towards?
just that, no, I just would reiterate, your emotions are critical to your wholeness and to loving well. They're God given. And so you have to take that message and compare it to the message you got about emotions growing up, or even from the church. And then secondly, you have to learn how to recognize your emotions, which usually comes first by paying attention to your body, because actually emotions are energy stored in your body. That's what an emotion is, energy in your body. And then that bodily energy sends a message to your brain. Now, what your brain does with it is a different story. Your body doesn't lie.
Right.
But your brain may deny, suppress, ignore, or avoid. That's where the problem is. So it's really important that you learn to begin to acknowledge them. And we just talked about how they can do that, taking time to think about, to feel them, to think about them. And then finally, then to discern them. Like discern, how is God coming to me through my emotions? That's another whole podcast.
Yeah. Yeah. And then how you respond to them as well. That a
Yes.
lot of that, I know for me with the anger, once I get it out on paper, it takes some of the steam out of it. So I don't feel like I'm gonna, be
Right.
tempted as much to sin in my anger,
Right. Right.
because I'm more in touch with it.
And then you can begin to think about what to do with it. What are my next steps? The proverb says a prudent person gives thought to their ways.
Mm,
And that includes in particularly your feelings. We have to give thought to it, and then we know what to do. Then we'll wisely know what to do with them.
that's great.
So yeah.
Wonderful. Geri, thank you so much. This has been such a helpful topic and one of my favorite chapters in the book. And thank you for being with us and sharing your wisdom. And thank you to our listeners who've been listening. Hopefully you've taken some gold nuggets of wisdom away with you about emotions.
And you know what? I'm not sure if we've even mentioned it, but for further unpacking of this, we can never cover everything in the podcast. Please get the book and the workbook so that you can, read much more about this in a fuller version.
Absolutely. And the workbook is wonderful because it gives you some practical tools to actually exercise these muscles you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I love the workbook starts out with actually an assessment
Yep.
around your emotions.
Yep.
Really helpful assessment. So anyway.
Yep. Yeah. So please go out there, check it out. It's a great study to do with a group of people as well. But thank you again, Geri, for being with us. And we will see you next time on the Emotionally Healthy Woman podcast.
Thank you.
Take care. Well, thank you again for listening to this 4th episode in season 1 of the Emotionally Healthy Woman podcast. And as a thank you for listening, we actually want to leave you with a free personal assessment resource. This assessment is a series of 40 questions. It only takes about 15 minutes to complete. And it's a diagnostic tool designed to help you get a sense of whether or not your discipleship has touched the emotional component of your life. This is a wonderful assessment that you can take for free by visiting emotionallyhealthy.org/mature. I'll say that again, www.emotionallyhealthy.org/mature, MATURE. Well, we hope you'll be able to take advantage of that free resource, and we hope you will also tune in next time to the Emotionally Healthy Woman podcast. Thanks so much for joining us.